Hey everyone. You know, people often judge others by the version of themselves they choose to show the world. A quiet guy, a steady job as a mail carrier, no issues with neighbors, no drama. A model citizen, right? Today, I'm going to show you what can be hiding behind a mask that ordinary. Monday, November 18th, 2024. East Kilbride, a quiet suburb outside Glasgow. Midday. A call comes into emergency services dispatch. The voice on the line is calm. No panic. No heavy breathing. No signs of distress. The 27-year-old caller matter-of-factly says he experienced a psychotic episode caused by prohibited substances and has just taken the life of his girlfriend. He then clearly provides his home address and asks officers to come and take him to jail. Less than 10 minutes later, responding officers arrive at an apartment on the top floor. They're expecting chaos, maybe resistance. Instead, they find the resident, Ewan Methven, calmly waiting in the living room. And in the hallway, partially covered by an ordinary towel, lies the body of 21-year-old Phoenix Spencer Horn. What officers encounter inside the apartment is so disturbing that it feels completely disconnected from the image of the unremarkable young man standing before them. How could someone with a spotless reputation do something like this inside his own home? And more importantly, why would investigators eventually discover that the answer to this crime might be hidden inside digital records dating back more than a decade? Let's walk through the timeline step by step. To understand how such a shocking scene became possible, we need to go back and look at who these two people were before they ever met. Because in everyday life, they projected completely different images to the people around them. Phoenix Spencer Horn was the kind of person many families rely on. The youngest of 4 siblings, she learned early on that goals were achieved through hard work. By the age of 20, this young woman was carrying an enormous workload. She worked at a local hotel while also picking up shifts at a cafe. What stands out most to me is how her employers described her. They said Phoenix didn't simply do her job and go home. She brought positive energy into every room she entered. She had a rare ability to calm frustrated customers without showing even the slightest hint of irritation. Arguments weren't her thing. She always looked for common ground and practical solutions. What we're looking at here is a deeply empathetic person with a clear vision for her future. Now let's turn our attention to Ewan Methven. Compared to Phoenix, he appeared almost completely static, though in a way society tends to find reassuring. An adult man working for the Postal Service. He continued living comfortably at his parents' home, stayed out of legal trouble, and spent his days delivering mail. To neighbors and co-workers, he was practically invisible, reliable, quiet, rule-following. No one viewed him as a threat. He blended into the background so naturally that most people barely noticed him at all. But when I look into cases like this, I keep coming back to the same question. Why do we automatically trust people simply because they're quiet? When digital forensic investigators dug into the past of this seemingly ordinary mail carrier, they uncovered old internet archives connected to him. What they found showed that between 2013 and 2015, Ewan had left behind some deeply disturbing online activity. Using anonymous usernames on various forums, he posted detailed discussions about fantasies involving harm toward other people. He openly expressed strong hostility toward women and argued that aggressive behavior was a legitimate way to maintain control. On top of that, he bragged about using prohibited substances and claimed he appeared in niche adult content. Just think about that contrast for a second. Ewan didn't get rid of those darker tendencies. What happened instead was that he realized views like those would quickly turn him into a social outcast. So he changed tactics. He abandoned the accounts that could expose him and put on the mask of an ordinary guy. He didn't overcome the anger he carried inside. He simply became better at hiding it from everyone around him. For years, he maintained the image of a quiet, unremarkable employee. And in the end, that carefully crafted appearance lowered the guard of the woman who would later become the target of his actions. In 2022, the paths of these two very different people crossed during a family gathering. That was the moment Ewan Methvin first demonstrated his carefully refined ability to blend into Phoenix Spencer Horn and the people closest to her. He was polite, attentive, and dependable. Everything about his behavior projected the image of a thoughtful and trustworthy partner. Phoenix's mother, Allison, would later tell the court that the young man seemed like an ideal match. Her relatives were genuinely happy. Beside their hard-working and caring daughter was someone who appeared responsible, stable, and employed in a straightforward profession with the Postal Service. A few months later, the couple decided to move in together. They rented a small apartment on the top floor of a residential building in the Glen Lee area on the outskirts of town. If you go back and look through their social media profiles from that period, you'll find what appears to be a perfectly happy relationship. Photos from trips together, pictures from parties, smiles, public declarations of love. The online version of their lives looked flawless. Post after post painted a picture of complete harmony, collecting hundreds of supportive reactions and comments. Not a single person in their circle realized that behind the closed doors of that apartment, things were already beginning to change. You know what stands out to me in situations like this? How quietly controlling partners establish power. The shift from a loving partner to a controlling figure didn't happen through explosive arguments or dramatic scenes. Ewan moved carefully, patiently, step by step, gradually creating an environment of constant psychological pressure. It started with small criticisms, nothing dramatic on its own, but they came regularly. He steadily chipped away at Phoenix's confidence through sharp comments about her appearance, her clothing choices, and her physical condition. Then came another tactic: emotional withdrawal. Whenever Phoenix did something that didn't align with what he wanted, Ewan would stop speaking to her entirely. He could ignore her for days at a time. They would be living together in the same apartment, sharing the same space, yet he would act as though she simply didn't exist. It was a deliberate message, a way of reminding her that attention, communication, and basic acknowledgement were things he controlled. For someone like Phoenix, who had always believed that every disagreement could be resolved through honest conversation and open communication, that kind of emotional coldness became incredibly difficult to deal with. Trying to fix things, she constantly searched for reasons within herself. She apologized. She adjusted her behavior. She worked harder and harder to meet his growing list of expectations. Once Ewan realized he had gained that unspoken power, he pushed even further and began controlling how she spent her time. Almost everything started bothering him. Her staying late after a shift at the hotel, conversations with co-workers from the cafe, even routine appointments at the nail salon or hairdresser. Step by step, he began cutting her off from the social connections that had always been part of her life. The goal was simple: to become the center of her world. Meanwhile, Phoenix continued to believe that these episodes of cold behavior were only temporary struggles caused by his personal insecurities. She was convinced that enough patience, support, and care would eventually help him overcome them. About halfway through the relationship, a turning point finally arrived. Phoenix decided to break away from the suffocating cycle of control and moved out. For someone whose personal boundaries had been slowly worn down day after day, it was a completely understandable decision. She openly told Ewan that she needed distance and temporarily ended their living arrangement. So how does a person with an unhealthy need for control react when faced with that kind of separation? Instead of respecting her decision, Ewan shifted into full pursuit mode. He refused to leave her alone. The messages never stopped. The phone calls were constant. He waited outside the hotel and cafe where Phoenix worked her shifts. Every tactic was put into play. He pleaded with her to come back. He promised to change. He insisted things would be different. Now let's focus on an important detail documented during the investigation. It was during this period of separation that Ewan began heavily using cocaine and anabolic steroids. That combination can have a serious impact on judgment, emotional regulation, and impulse control. In many cases, it can contribute to sudden bursts of aggression and increasingly unpredictable behavior. What this effectively meant was that the darker impulses he had spent years hiding behind anonymous online accounts were now becoming harder and harder to keep under control. He was growing more impulsive, more volatile, more unpredictable. But because of the way Phoenix viewed people, she interpreted those changes very differently. Court records and statements from those closest to her show that she genuinely believed Ewan was spiraling because of the breakup itself, and she felt responsible for helping him. She believed her support and presence could help him walk away from dangerous habits and get his life back on track. Driven by that hope, Phoenix made the decision that would ultimately change everything. She moved back into the apartment in the Glenlee neighborhood. It's remarkable how often people confuse a partner's struggles with actual willingness to change. At the same time, Phoenix kept almost all of this hidden from her own family. Her mother and relatives had no idea how unhealthy the situation inside the relationship had become. She didn't want to burden them with problems at home or cause unnecessary worry. Instead, she confided only in a small circle of close friends. Those private conversations became her only outlet. It was there, in personal messages, that she occasionally admitted she was becoming frightened by Ewan's behavior, and that the atmosphere inside their shared apartment felt increasingly difficult to live with. And Ewan wasn't simply continuing to use stimulants. By that point, he had effectively turned their home into an environment of constant instability. The couple resumed living together, but now every day carried a sense of uncertainty, because his growing dependence on those substances had stripped away much of the self-control that had once allowed him to maintain the appearance of a calm and ordinary person. Saturday, November 16th, 2024. The tension inside the top-floor apartment had reached a breaking point. Shortly before noon, Ewan returned home from work. The apartment was empty because Phoenix was working a shift at the coffee shop. Alone in the apartment, he began sending her a series of text messages. The messages were filled with complaints. He expressed frustration about her work schedule and argued that he was being forced to spend his day off by himself. Investigators would later recover these exchanges through phone records. Phoenix responded that she would be finished later and suggested ordering takeout so they could spend a quiet evening together. At around 9 o'clock that night, she returned home. The couple ordered food delivery and sat down for dinner. At 9:30 p.m., Phoenix sent her final message to her mother. There was nothing unusual about it. No indication that anything was wrong. Just a brief update, saying the day was over and everything was fine. With that ordinary message, Phoenix's documented digital activity came to an end. What happened next is where the timeline becomes deeply unsettling. Sunday morning, November 17th. Phoenix's mother sent her a routine message, but by then, the phone was no longer in Phoenix's possession. Ewan replied instead. He told her mother that Phoenix was still asleep and would get back to her later. Sometime afterward, he sent another message. This time, he attempted to imitate Phoenix's writing style. He claimed she had just woken up, apologized for the delayed response, and reassured her mother that everything was going well. The purpose of those messages was simple: to buy time, to delay concern, and prevent anyone from immediately looking for her. But the messages themselves weren't the only disturbing part of the story. Investigators also examined what Ewan was doing while Phoenix remained inside the apartment. Digital forensic data showed that throughout Sunday, he visited adult content websites approximately 170 times. While everything around him was unfolding, he appeared focused on consuming online content and continuing his day as though nothing had happened. There was no sign of urgency, no sign of panic. At one point, he took the keys to Phoenix's vehicle, left the apartment, got behind the wheel, and drove away. According to investigators, the purpose of that trip was to obtain another supply of prohibited substances. He then returned to the apartment and resumed his routine. Meanwhile, an important detail was developing next door. A woman living in a neighboring apartment noticed something unusual. Near the kitchen area, where the walls of the two units shared a common boundary, an unusual and unpleasant odor began to appear. She didn't think much of it at the time. She assumed it was some kind of ventilation issue. What she was noticing were the first physical signs that something was wrong inside the apartment above. Ewan remained inside, almost completely isolated from the outside world. And as the hours continued to pass, the carefully constructed story he was presenting to others was moving closer and closer to reality catching up with it. 2 days before Phoenix was ultimately found, events had unfolded behind those apartment walls during the early hours of Sunday morning. Investigators would later reconstruct what happened, and they did so not through Ewan's inconsistent explanations, but through physical evidence and statements provided by independent witnesses. Those pieces of evidence would ultimately tell a far clearer story than any account he attempted to give himself. The first major timestamp came from the neighbors living downstairs. A man who lived directly below the apartment later told investigators that at exactly midnight on Saturday, November 16th, he heard a sudden, heavy impact from the unit above. After that, he could clearly hear intense movement and unusual activity overhead that continued for quite some time. As you can probably guess, that single loud thud became the only audible clue, marking the beginning of what was happening inside the apartment. The forensic investigation later helped reconstruct the physical sequence of events. Everything began in one of the rooms where a confrontation occurred between the couple. According to the medical examiner's findings, Ewan initially used a forceful restraint that restricted Phoenix's ability to breathe. She quickly lost consciousness and collapsed to the floor. Investigators believe that fall was the impact the downstairs neighbor heard shortly after midnight. At that point, Phoenix was no longer able to protect herself. What happened afterward would become one of the key reasons investigators challenged Ewan's claim that he had been acting during a chaotic substance-induced psychotic episode. Court records show that 3 separate kitchen knives were involved during the incident. Investigators determined that Ewan retrieved them one after another. And that raises an obvious question. If someone is truly acting in complete panic and confusion, why would they repeatedly switch between different tools? Forensic experts documented a total of 20 sharp force injuries. A significant number were concentrated around the facial area, while others were located on the upper torso. Medical examiners ultimately concluded that the injuries to the chest area were responsible for the loss of life. But the final part of the timeline proved even more disturbing to investigators. After realizing Phoenix had passed away, Ewan moved her into the bathroom. Evidence suggested he then attempted to alter and conceal what had occurred in order to remove evidence from the scene. According to prosecutors, he intended to place remains into bags and remove them from the apartment. However, the process proved far more difficult than he anticipated. Eventually, he abandoned that plan. Investigators found that he left the bathroom, moved Phoenix back into the hallway near the front entrance, covered her with a towel, and left her there until officers arrived. That doesn't look like a moment of uncontrollable confusion. It looks far more like a calculated plan that ultimately failed. Monday, November 18th, 2024, was the day concern finally spread beyond the walls of the apartment. The first people to notice something was wrong were employees at the hotel, where Phoenix was scheduled to begin her morning shift. She was known for being dependable and never failed to notify coworkers if she was running late. When she didn't show up, management immediately tried contacting her. The calls went unanswered. At first, coworkers assumed she might simply be feeling under the weather. What they didn't know was that, at that very moment, her partner was already speaking with an emergency services dispatcher. After his arrest, Ewan was taken into custody, while investigators began documenting and processing evidence. And that's when another chapter of the case began. His legal team attempted to build a defense centered on diminished responsibility. Attorneys argued that he had been experiencing an acute psychotic episode caused by a powerful combination of prohibited substances. According to that argument, he was completely disconnected from reality and incapable of understanding his actions. So here's the question. Investigators, prosecutors, and eventually the court had to consider, was this truly a complete loss of control, or was it a calculated attempt to reduce responsibility for what had happened? That entire defense strategy fell apart once prosecutors presented a minute-by-minute reconstruction of Ewan's actions throughout the weekend. Investigators made a straightforward argument. A person experiencing a completely uncontrolled psychotic break would not be capable of maintaining the appearance of normal life for nearly a day and a half. The level of organization shown in his actions told a very different story. From creating a false alibi to carefully managing his daily activities, every step suggested planning, awareness, and deliberate decision-making. Those actions required a clear and focused state of mind. The prosecution argued that his conduct after the crime demonstrated conscious and rational thinking, leaving little support for the theory that he had temporarily lost touch with reality. While these legal battles were unfolding, Phoenix's family was living through an ordeal of their own. Preparing for court proceedings stretched across many months. Relatives found themselves repeatedly forced to review disturbing forensic findings and investigative details. In public statements, family members admitted they were overwhelmed by guilt. They constantly asked themselves the same painful questions. How had they overlooked the warning signs? Why hadn't they recognized the unhealthy dynamics that now seemed so obvious in hindsight? And why hadn't they taken those concerns more seriously when there was still time? The final turning point before trial came on June 17th, 2025, at the High Court in Glasgow. By that stage, the physical evidence, digital records, and witness testimony had created an overwhelming case. Realizing there was little room left to challenge the facts, Ewan changed course. He formally entered a guilty plea to the intentional crime that took Phoenix's life. As a result, a full jury trial was no longer necessary. but one critical question remained unanswered. What punishment would the court impose on someone whose actions had permanently taken away Phoenix's future and everything she had hoped to accomplish? The sentencing hearing took place on July 14th, 2025, inside the High Court of Glasgow. Before Lord Matthews left the courtroom to consider his decision, the defense submitted a written statement from Ewan. In that statement, he claimed he could not understand why he had done what he did. His attorneys presented those words as evidence of remorse and as support for the argument that he had experienced a sudden mental breakdown. Their hope was that the court might reduce the minimum sentence. But that raises an important question. Can a statement like that truly be viewed as remorse when the evidence is already overwhelming and the person making it is facing the possibility of the harshest available punishment? Lord Matthews publicly read portions of the statement. His response was direct and unmistakable. He said the letter explained nothing. It offered no meaningful answers, and it provided no comfort to Phoenix's family. The court further noted that expert evaluations found no evidence suggesting Ewan had lost control of his actions during the attack. In fact, many of his decisions afterward pointed in the opposite direction. His attempts to impersonate Phoenix through text messages and maintain a false narrative demonstrated that his reasoning abilities remained intact. Lord Matthews placed particular emphasis on what happened after Phoenix lost her life. The judge stated that Ewan had taken far more than her future. According to the court, his actions afterward stripped away basic human dignity and caused additional suffering for those who loved her. The effort to alter, conceal, and dispose of evidence left lasting emotional damage on the family and deprived them of the opportunity to say goodbye in the way they had hoped. The judge noted that conduct of this nature is treated with the utmost seriousness under Scottish law and is considered among the most aggravating factors a court can evaluate during sentencing. The court's final decision was life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 23 years. Under that sentence, Ewan will not be eligible to apply for parole until 2047. Neither prosecutors nor Phoenix's family chose to challenge the ruling. Under Scottish sentencing guidelines, a minimum term of that length is considered significant for a case of this nature. Even so, those closest to Phoenix made it clear that no number of years behind bars could bring her back. The verdict also sparked a broader conversation across Scotland. People began asking difficult questions. Can someone who successfully concealed harmful tendencies for years ever be considered safe to re-enter society? The case forced many to confront an uncomfortable reality. Ewan's story demonstrated that a person can appear completely ordinary while keeping darker impulses hidden beneath the surface for a very long time. If someone is capable of maintaining that image for years, what assurances exist that the same pattern won't repeat itself after release? Those questions continue to be debated today. In East Kilbride, one simple memorial now serves as a reminder of Phoenix's story. Directly across from the hotel where she once worked her shifts, a wooden memorial bench has been installed. Attached to it is a small plaque bearing her name. Friends, relatives, and members of the community still visit the site to remember her. And in many ways, that's what remains at the heart of this entire case. Not the court proceedings, not the headlines, not the legal arguments, but the memory of a young woman whose future was taken away far too soon. For many people in the community, Phoenix's story became a reminder that outward appearances don't always reveal what's happening beneath the surface, and that sometimes the people who seem the most ordinary are the ones we understand the least.